12,000 people packed into the historic venue for what was advertised as a tribute to gospel music legends. The evening's headliner was Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, and one of the most revered voices in gospel and soul music history. But what nobody in that audience knew, not even Whitney herself, was that Cissy was about to face the most terrifying moment of her entire career. And what Whitney did when her mother's voice gave out mid-performance would prove that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't fame or fortune, but the courage to sacrifice everything for the people who gave you everything. The night began with an energy that only gospel music can create. Cissy Houston had been performing for over 40 years, her voice a bridge between generations of music lovers. She had sung backup for Aretha Franklin, Dionne Warwick, and Elvis Presley. She had raised a daughter who would become one of the greatest voices of all time. But on this November night in Newark, the city where she was born and raised, Cissy was performing for her people, her community, the church folks who had known her since she was a little girl singing in New Hope Baptist Church. What the audience didn't know was that Cissy had been suffering from severe throat problems for weeks. Her doctor, Dr. Stephen Wallace, had examined her 3 days before the concert and found vocal cord inflammation that required immediate rest. "Cissy, if you perform this weekend, you risk permanent damage to your voice," Dr. Wallace had warned her. "The blood vessels in your vocal cords are already compromised. One wrong note, one moment of strain, and you could hemorrhage." But Cissy Houston was not the kind of woman who canceled commitments. The Newark tribute concert had been planned for months. Local churches had sold tickets to raise money for their youth music programs. Young gospel singers were attending specifically to hear the woman who had influenced their entire musical education. How could she let them down? "I've sung through worse," Cissy told her daughter Robin during a phone call the night before the concert. "I sang through your daddy leaving. I sang through financial struggles. I sang through Whitney's difficult years. My voice has never failed me before." What Cissy didn't mention was the blood she had been coughing up after rehearsals, the sharp pain that shot through her throat every time she attempted her signature high notes, the terrifying moments when her voice would simply disappear mid-sentence, leaving her gasping and confused. Whitney Houston, who was in Lowe's Angels finishing her own album recordings, had no idea her mother was in danger. Cissy had kept the medical situation completely secret, not wanting to worry her daughter or disrupt her work. In the Houston family, you carried your burdens alone and solved your problems without complaint. But Cissy's closest friend, Emily Morrison, knew something was seriously wrong. "I watched her during sound check that afternoon," Emily later recalled. "She was taking breaks between every song. She kept drinking hot tea with honey and lemon. And when she thought nobody was looking, I saw her touching her throat like it was hurting her. I asked if she was okay, and she just smiled and said, 'The Lord will provide.'" As the concert began that evening, Cissy Houston walked onto the Newark Symphony Hall stage looking radiant in a royal blue gown, her signature elegant style on full display. The crowd rose to their feet immediately, applauding the gospel legend who had given them so much beautiful music over the decades. But those who knew her well noticed something different in her eyes. A flicker of fear that wasn't usually there. A tension in her smile that suggested she was fighting something the audience couldn't see. Cissy opened with Sweet Inspiration, one of her signature songs from her days with the Sweet Inspirations vocal group. Her voice, though powerful, had a slightly raspy quality that her longtime fans immediately noticed. "She sounds different tonight," whispered Martha Jenkins to her husband in the 5th row. "Her voice usually has this crystal clarity, but there's something rough about it." Song after song, Cissy pushed through her set with the professionalism of a lifetime performer. She sang Midnight Train to Georgia, I Say a Little Prayer, and several traditional gospel hymns that had the audience on their feet clapping and swaying. But backstage, her musical director, James Crawford, was growing increasingly concerned. During the instrumental breaks, she would rush off stage to drink water and press cold compresses against her throat, James remembered. "I kept asking if she wanted to cut the set short, but she refused. She kept saying, 'These people paid money. They deserve a full show.' The crisis came during How Sweet It Is, a song that required Cissy to hit and sustain several challenging high notes. As she approached the song's emotional climax, something went terribly wrong. Cissy reached for a high note that she had sung thousands of times before, but instead of the clear, powerful tone everyone expected, her voice cracked horribly. Then it simply stopped. Complete silence. 12,000 people watched in shock as Cissy Houston grabbed her throat with both hands, her eyes wide with panic and fear. The orchestra continued playing for a few bars before the conductor frantically signaled them to stop. The symphony hall fell into complete, terrifying silence. Cissy tried to speak into the microphone to explain what was happening, but no sound came out. Her mouth moved, but her legendary voice, the voice that had brought joy to millions, had simply vanished. Blood began trickling from the corner of her mouth, a small crimson stream that looked black under the stage lights. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a physician who happened to be in the audience, rushed toward the stage. "I knew immediately it was a vocal cord hemorrhage," he later explained. The blood, the sudden complete loss of voice, the way she was holding her throat. This was a medical emergency that required immediate hospitalization. Security helped Cissy backstage as the audience sat in stunned silence. The concert's organizer, Reverend William Hayes, took the microphone to inform the crowd that there would be a brief intermission while they assessed Cissy's condition. But everyone in that building knew this was more than a temporary setback. Something serious was happening to one of gospel music's greatest voices. Backstage, the scene was chaotic. Dr. Thompson was examining Cissy's throat while paramedics prepared to transport her to University Hospital. The diagnosis was clear and devastating. Cissy had experienced a complete vocal cord hemorrhage, likely caused by weeks of inflammation and strain. She needed immediate surgery and months of vocal rest. More importantly, there was no guarantee her voice would ever fully recover. "The blood vessels in her vocal cords have ruptured," Dr. Thompson explained to the medical team and to Reverend Hayes. "At her age and with this level of damage, the recovery prognosis is uncertain. She may never sing again." Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. Cissy Houston, who had dedicated her entire life to music, who had influenced generations of singers, who had sung at civil rights rallies and presidential inaugurations, might never sing again. But what nobody knew was that 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, Whitney Houston was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Emily Morrison, Cissy's friend, had managed to get through to Whitney's manager with an urgent message. "You need to tell Whitney what's happening. Her mother needs her." When Whitney's phone rang at 9:47 p.m. Pacific Time, she was in the middle of a recording session for what would become one of her biggest hits. "Whitney, it's about your mother," her manager said, his voice heavy with concern. "She collapsed during a concert in Newark. They're taking her to the hospital. It's her throat. It's serious." Whitney Houston did not hesitate. She walked out of the recording studio, leaving producers and musicians waiting. She drove directly to Lax and bought a ticket on the next red-eye flight to Newark. Within hours, she was in the air, traveling across the country to be with her mother. But what happened when Whitney arrived at University Hospital was not what anyone expected. Cissy was being prepared for emergency surgery, heavily sedated and unable to speak. The doctors explained the situation to Whitney with brutal honesty. "Your mother has suffered extensive damage to her vocal cords. We can attempt repair, but there's no guarantee. She may lose significant range. She may never perform again." Whitney sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding Cissy's hand as the older woman drifted in and out of consciousness. In those quiet moments, Whitney made a decision that would shock the music industry and prove the depth of her love for her mother. She pulled out her phone and called her manager. "Cancel everything," she said quietly but firmly. "Cancel the recording sessions, cancel the upcoming tour dates, cancel all promotional appearances for the next 6 months. I'm staying here with my mother." Her manager tried to explain the consequences. "Whitney, you have contractual obligations. The label is expecting the new album. There are millions of dollars at stake. Your career momentum." "I don't care," Whitney interrupted. "My mother gave me everything. She taught me how to sing. She protected me. She sacrificed for me. Now it's my turn. Clear my schedule. I'm not leaving Newark until my mother can sing again." But Whitney's sacrifice went even deeper than anyone realized. When she learned that Cissy's surgery and rehabilitation would require specialized care that insurance wouldn't fully cover, Whitney didn't think twice. She paid for everything: the surgery, the rehabilitation, the specialists, the experimental treatments. She spent over $800,000 of her own money to give her mother the best possible chance of recovery. What Whitney did next shocked everyone who knew her, including her mother. She moved into Cissy's Newark home for 6 months, putting her entire career on hold to become her mother's full-time caregiver and rehabilitation coach. This was Whitney Houston at the peak of her fame, one of the biggest stars in the world, living in Newark, New Jersey, helping her mother relearn how to use her voice. "I would wake up at 5 in the morning," Whitney later told Oprah Winfrey, "and I would do vocal exercises with my mother. Not singing exercises, basic exercises, humming, breathing, gentle sounds. The same exercises she had taught me when I was a little girl, except now I was teaching her." The rehabilitation process was grueling and heartbreaking. Cissy, who had always been strong and independent, was now dependent on her daughter for the most basic tasks. Speaking was painful, eating was difficult, and the possibility that she might never sing again hung over every day like a dark cloud. "I watched my mother cry," Whitney recalled, her own voice breaking with emotion. This woman who had always been so strong, so confident, she would try to sing a simple scale and nothing would come out and she would just break down. And I would hold her and tell her the same things she told me when I was struggling. "Your voice is a gift, but it's not who you are. You are loved for who you are, not just for what you can do." 3 months into the rehabilitation, Cissy's doctors delivered devastating news. The surgery had not been as successful as hoped. Significant scar tissue had formed on her vocal cords. She would likely never regain her full range. Professional singing at the level she had maintained for 40 years was probably impossible. That night, Cissy told Whitney to go back to her career. "Baby, you've done enough. You've sacrificed too much already. Your mother will be fine. You need to get back to your life." But Whitney refused. "Mama, you didn't quit on me when I was struggling. You didn't give up on me during my worst times. I'm not giving up on you now. We're going to get your voice back. I don't care how long it takes." What happened over the next 3 months was nothing short of miraculous. Whitney, using everything her mother had taught her about vocal technique, worked with Cissy's speech therapists and vocal rehabilitation specialists to develop a new approach. Instead of trying to restore Cissy's old voice, they would help her discover a new one. "We started with gospel hymns," Whitney explained. "The same songs my mother used to sing to me as a child. Amazing Grace, His Eye is on the Sparrow." Songs that were in her soul, not just in her vocal cords, and slowly something beautiful started happening. Cissy's voice began to return, but it was different. Lower, richer, more textured. The crystalline high notes might have been gone, but in their place was something equally powerful. A depth and emotional resonance that came from suffering and survival. 6 months after her collapse on the Newark Symphony Hall stage, Cissy Houston was ready to sing again. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. Whitney had arranged something special, a small, private concert at New Hope Baptist Church, the place where Cissy had first learned to sing as a little girl. The church held only 300 people, mostly family, close friends, and members of the congregation who had known Cissy for decades. There was no media, no cameras, no recording equipment. This was just for the people who loved her. When Cissy walked to the front of the church, supported by Whitney, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. She stood before the simple microphone, took a deep breath, and began to sing Amazing Grace. Her voice was different, there was no denying it. The soaring high notes were gone, replaced by a deeper, more grounded sound. But what came from Cissy Houston that day was perhaps more powerful than anything she had sung before. It was a voice that had been broken and healed, a voice that knew suffering and redemption, a voice that understood grace not as a concept, but as a lived experience. As Cissy sang, Whitney stood beside her, adding harmonies. Mother and daughter, their voices intertwining in a way they never had before. 2 generations of Houston women singing together about amazing grace that saves wretches like them. The congregation rose to their feet, not in performance applause, but in genuine spiritual response. They were witnessing something sacred. Not just the return of a voice, but the power of love to heal what seems irreparably broken. When the song ended, Cissy spoke publicly for the first time since her collapse. Her speaking voice was still recovering, slightly hoarse but clear. 6 months ago, I thought I had lost everything, she said. I thought my voice was who I was, but my daughter taught me something I had somehow forgotten. She taught me that love is more powerful than any voice, that sacrifice is more beautiful than any song. That being a mother, and having a daughter who loves you enough to give up everything for you, that's the real gift. Cissy turned to Whitney, tears streaming down both their faces. Whitney, you gave up 6 months of your career to give me back my voice, but what you really gave me was the understanding that I was never just a voice. I was always a mother, and you were always my greatest gift. Whitney Houston's sacrifice for her mother became legendary in the music industry, though she never sought publicity for it. Word spread about how the world's biggest pop star had walked away from fame and fortune to care for her mother. The 6 months Whitney spent with Cissy changed their relationship fundamentally. Those months in Newark saved my relationship with my mother, Whitney later admitted. She was just my mama who needed me, and I was just her daughter who loved her. The story changed how both women approached their music. Cissy never returned to the demanding performance schedule she had maintained before. Her new voice, lower and richer, found a different audience. Whitney returned to her career with renewed perspective, dedicating her next album to my mother, Cissy Houston, who taught me that the greatest performance is not on a stage, but in the quiet moments when we sacrifice for the people we love. The story reveals something profound about the nature of love itself. In an industry built on ego and self-promotion, Whitney chose humility and service. In a world that measures success by chart positions and album sales, she chose to measure success by whether her mother could sing Amazing Grace again. The $800,000 Whitney spent on her mother's medical care was never publicly discussed during either woman's lifetime. She had dipped into money set aside for her own children's education. She had turned down endorsement deals worth millions because she wouldn't leave her mother's side. Whitney never wanted credit for any of it, said Pat Houston, Whitney's sister-in-law. She'd say, my mother would have done the same for me. This was just my chance to return the favor. In 2009, mother and daughter performed together one final time at a benefit concert. Cissy was now in her 70s, Whitney battling her own demons. But when they sang Bridge Over Troubled Water together that night, their voices, both imperfect, both bearing scars of their respective battles, created something more beautiful than technical perfection ever could. The audience knew they were witnessing something precious. These two voices were giving evidence that love can survive anything, that family bonds can withstand the pressures of fame, that sacrifice, real sacrifice, is never wasted. When Cissy Houston published her autobiography, she dedicated an entire chapter to the 6 months after her vocal cord hemorrhage. She titled the chapter, The Time My Daughter Saved My Life. In it, she wrote, people ask me about my greatest performance, expecting me to talk about singing backup for Aretha or Elvis, or about my solo recordings, or about teaching Whitney. But my greatest performance was lying in that hospital bed, letting my daughter care for me, letting her see me weak, letting her give to me the way I had given to her. That took more courage than any high note I ever attempted. And the song we created together during those 6 months, the song of a mother accepting love from her daughter, that's the most beautiful music I ever made. Whitney's response to her mother's words was characteristically humble. In a rare interview where she discussed that period, she said simply, my mama gave me everything. Everything I am, everything I achieved came from her. When she needed me, there was never a question of whether I would be there. The only question was how quickly I could get to Newark. This story of Cissy Houston's collapse and Whitney's sacrifice teaches us something essential about love and family. It shows us that our greatest moments often come not from our triumphs, but from our willingness to set aside our triumphs to serve those who made our triumphs possible. It reminds us that fame and fortune mean nothing if we can't use them to help the people who helped us. That 6 months away from the spotlight can be worth more than 6 years in it. That the greatest gift we can give someone is not our success, but our presence in their time of need. Cissy Houston lived until 2024, her voice never quite returning to its pre-collapse glory, but her spirit stronger than ever. Whitney passed in 2012, her relationship with her mother, one of the few consistently healthy parts of her complex life. but the 6 months they spent together in Newark in 1990, 11992 remained. For both of them, a treasured memory of when love proved stronger than ambition, when family proved more important than fame, and when a daughter repaid her mother's lifetime of sacrifice with a sacrifice of her own. The New Hope Baptist Church, where Cissy and Whitney sang together for that small congregation after Cissy's recovery, has a small plaque near the front of the sanctuary. It reads, "In this place, Cissy Houston found her voice again, and Whitney Houston found what really matters." November 1992. That plaque, seen by few outside the congregation, represents one of the most powerful moments in gospel music history. Not because of vocal excellence or technical perfection, but because it captured the moment when two of music's greatest voices united not in performance, but in love. What would you sacrifice for the people who sacrificed for you? How can we honor those who gave us everything by giving them everything when they need us? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of mother-daughter love and sacrifice touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to remember what really matters in life. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more incredible stories that show the power of love to heal, the courage to sacrifice, and the beauty of family bonds that survive everything. Until next time, remember that the greatest performances happen not on stages, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over everything else.